Good morning, everybody. Happy somewhere in the middle of the Easter holidays. Who knows what day it is now. And welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's political editor, John Stevens. Morning, John.
Hi, morning, Susie.
Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast are just going to have to pray they all go back to school soon. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a right royal ruckus over the coronation. I love a right royal ruckus. With the seating plans in disarray thanks to Harry, a special ramp for the king in case he trips up or has to go on casters, I assume, and massive overruns in rehearsals. Now, there's more on that inside, and it's a great picture of what's going on from our colleague Russell Myers on the chaos behind the scenes as we approach next month's ceremony, when hopefully it'll all go according to plan and Charles will stop magnetising all those eggs that seem to keep coming his way. But first, I want to take you to page 12, where two white journalists are going to discuss allegations of racism between two brown women. Now, John, this story centres on the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and her immigration policies, as well as her sort of general handling of events. And it's come from Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, former Tory minister under David Cameron, and apparently not a fan. So what's happened?
Yeah, so Sayeeda Warsi used to be the Tory chairman under David Cameron. Suella Braverman's obviously now in government as the Home Secretary, and she's got quite a reputation, Suella Braverman, of stirring the pot, saying things that are very controversial. And the latest thing that's caused a massive row, aside from the Rwanda plans and all of her plans to put asylum seekers on barges, last week she was talking about child grooming gangs, and she did a series of interviews. She went on Sky and other channels, and she kept talking about Pakistani men and grooming gangs. And she's been criticised. People said this is divisive. She was deliberately trying to stoke up tensions. And they say, if you look at the Home Office's own reports into this back in 2020, they commissioned their own review. And they actually found that the people who were most responsible for child sexual offences were white men. And so the criticism from different groups, different Muslim organisations, different charities has been that rather than trying to find a way through this, Suella Braverman is deliberately inflaming tensions. And the latest person to say this is Sayeeda Warsi, who gave a couple of interviews, including one to my colleague Dave Burke. And she was saying that Rishi Sunak, she thought he was going to be a new brew. It was all going to be a new start after Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. And rather than getting that fresh new start, you've actually had Suella Braverman dragging him into the gutter and using this kind of divisive rhetoric again.
Yeah. Now, some of the stuff that she said yesterday, Baroness Warsi, is quite interesting. So she said that we needed a grown-up in the role of Home Secretary. She said Miss Braverman was rabble-rousing. She said, I genuinely hope this is not what we're going to see on a week-by-week basis. It's irresponsible, divisive rhetoric. She said she's a Home Secretary that can't make policy on evidence and is unable to communicate policy in a way that doesn't need to rabble-rouse and be racist rhetoric. That divisive rhetoric might win you a couple of votes. It might even win you an election, but it damages the country, and your commitment to your country should come over and above your commitment to the party. And she's saying there, you know, she shouldn't be our strategy for the next 18 months to blow this sort of racist dog whistle, I suppose. Is this allegations of racism, John, or is it more allegations about competence or electioneering? You know, are they saying that, as Baroness Warsi saying basically that Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak are doing this to stoke discontent and discord and to win? it's a callous and cynical attempt to get votes, populist votes, rather than actually genuinely held beliefs on Suella Braverman's part? Or are they saying she's just an idiot and she keeps saying stupid stuff?
I think it is a deliberate strategy. It isn't just a mistake that Suella Braverman goes out and says these things. And Rishi Sunak knew exactly what he was getting when he appointed Suella Braverman. She's not made a secret about her beliefs. She ran in that Tory leadership race in the summer, got a lot of attention for things she was saying. She was obviously appointed as Home Secretary by Liz Truss, and then she was sacked, and then he brought her back 6 days later when Rishi Sunak got back into power. So he knew exactly what he was doing. And I think this is a deliberate strategy, that Rishi Sunak is worried about the kind of right side of British politics. People like Nigel Farage, he's worried about, could they make some sort of resurgence? Obviously, you had the Brexit Party, which merged into or morphed into Reform UK, which hasn't had quite the impact that Brexit Party did under Nigel Farage. But that's always bubbling away along or under the surface. And there's a lot of people in the Tory Party who worry about, gosh, if you don't kind of mark that right flank, are you going to end up with a resurgent Nigel Farage who managed to cream off loads of votes in key constituencies? And so I think it's clearly something they're doing deliberately. It's clearly she's out there to kind of mark that territory, kind of guard off that kind of Farageist wing of voters in the country. And she's doing a job for Rishi Sunak that he wants her to do. The problem is, does she then poison things? So in those other seats where, you know, there's Tories are fighting different kind of battles all over the country, in some facing Labour, in some seats, kind of those seats around the southern England, around the southwest, they're fighting the Liberal Democrats. They're worried about resurgence of the Liberal Democrats, those ones around the home counties. And so I think there is a danger that, yeah, you might be able to see off the Brexit Party or Reform UK or whatever they're calling themselves these days. But if you poison the Tory Party and you end up losing loads of seats to the Lib Dems in the home counties, then that's kind of self-defeating.
Exactly. They've got a split base now, haven't they? But you say between sort of the more sort of soft Tory and then the new sort of the red wall voters and so on. What do you think, everybody? I know that Facebook has been disconnecting. We're still all good on YouTube and Twitter. The rest of you still working. So we can see the YouTube comments, and we'll try and have a dive into some of the Twitter comments later on. You might have to be commenting on there, though. What do you think about Suella Braverman? Is she being racist? Is this a cynical ploy by the Conservatives? Or do you think it's an issue of competence? I mean, John, this just sort of helps Labour, really, doesn't it? It doesn't help the Tories at all. I mean, it helps them a bit maybe in some of those seats, like you say. But in particular, Baroness Varsi she raised this issue of a pub landlord in Essex whose gaff got raided by police after someone reported a shelf full of Gollywog dolls over the bar. Now, that was reported elsewhere as sort of a police overreaction, and Suella Braverman then criticised it because it was the Daily Mail asking her to. But Baroness Varsi says the landlord had been posting on Facebook that they used to hang them in Mississippi, you know, and she shouldn't have waded in like that, that it was just a general issue of tone as well as, I suppose, competence as well. Is this an issue of one person accusing someone else of racism quite reasonably? Do you think they're of different faiths, these women? Is that part of it? Or is it just more of a despair, sort of the old guard of the Tory party? And Varsi's now in the House of Lords, so she's a senior stateswoman, I suppose, who just see the ones who are running the country now and are not terribly impressed by them, do you think?
I think there's a worry from a lot of people in the Tory party about competence, that you've got people like Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman who've been very good at identifying issues like small boats, seeing that there is public concern about this and kind of hyping this up into, it's clearly a big problem. You've got thousands of people making dangerous journeys, risking their lives. That's obviously an awful, awful thing that does need to be dealt with. But they've been very good at kind of branding this problem, going out there, stop the boats in lecterns and things like that. And I think now there is a pressure on the government that you can only do that stuff for so long before people start saying, well, did you really stop the boats? Have you started to get the numbers going down? And if you look at the numbers so far, you know, the last 7 days, there've been more people crossing than in any 7 days so far this year. And I think that will be the big question for people like Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak is, yeah, you're good at identifying these problems, but are you any good at solving them?
No, they kind of just make a problem for themselves almost at the ballot box, don't they? By shouting about it being the problem and then not fixing it. You know, whose fault is it this week, Suella? It's obviously not yours, is it? It must be someone else's again. We'll have to sort of see how things pan out with that, but it's an interesting look into the sort of what's the internal workings of the Conservative Party. Thank you for that, John. I think Facebook is back with us now. Mark Zuckerberg has obviously put the plug back in. Thank you, Mark. Now to the main event, and today is the second full day of the junior doctors strike, with around 60,000, that's half the workforce of junior doctors, walking out and not returning until 7 a.m. on Saturday. This is not the day to go chainsawing that tree down in your garden, everybody. Leave it till next week. With the British Medical Association and the government are at loggerheads and they're refusing to talk. So it's feared, it's reported here, that these strikes could go on until the next general election, just over a year away. Now, John, these 4 days have already been pretty bad for a lot of patients. There's been 350,000 cancelled appointments. The NHS is basically operating like a field hospital, doing what it can. People getting routine work cancelled. Another year of this is going to be a killer, isn't it? What is the Health Secretary going to do?
Well, I mean, there definitely is a sense of deja vu that we've already been around this circuit a couple of times already this year with the nurses' strike and with the ambulances strike. And remember with that, at the very start of it, you had the government saying they weren't willing to hold any talks on pay with either the ambulance workers or the nurses. That went on for ages. They held strikes. There were warnings from hospital bosses and patients about the impact it was having on people who needed urgent treatment. And then it went on and on and on. You had the Tories saying, oh, no, we're not going to hold any talks. And then eventually they got round the table, they were sensible, and both sides managed to find a solution, which meant that the strikes got called off. And you would think, after going through all of that, why they would want to repeat this by saying, we're not going to get around the table with the junior doctors, they're being unreasonable, we can't even begin talks with them, then I think that is problematic. And you look at the polling so far, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the latest poll, I think, it's about 50% in support and about 25% opposed them. So again, strong public support for the striking junior doctors. And the excuse that government's coming up with, I was in the Number 10 briefing yesterday when they were saying, well, the junior doctors want a pay rise of 35%. That's unreasonable. So until they drop that, we're not even going to get round the table with them. And I think most people would accept that clearly junior doctors aren't going to get a pay rise of 35%, no matter whether they deserve that or want that or whatever. In the real world, that's just not going to happen. But that's clearly a starting point for the negotiations. And the only way you're going to find some middle way to sort is if you sit down and get round the table. And I think there's a risk for the government that they look like they're the ones being unreasonable if they aren't even willing to sit down with the junior doctors to try and sort this out. And if you're one of the many people around the country on waiting lists, waiting for treatment, then I think you would want the government to do everything they could to get these strikes called off when they can be so disruptive for people's treatment.
Exactly. You'd have thought, wouldn't you, that when you go into the next general election, whoever's in government would want to be able to say, we ended the doctors' strike, not we refuse to pay doctors more and the strike's still going on. You know, that would be a very bad look for whoever's in charge. Enid says, this is why people go private. Strikes, no pay for them. I don't know quite what the last bit means, but it is why some people go private. And of course, some of the NHS money is being used to fund private treatment in order to clear some of the backlogs as a result of COVID. So, you know, the way that the health service is currently being run is already giving an awful lot of taxpayers' money to private healthcare for things which aren't necessarily actually clearing a lot of the backlogs. What do you think, everybody? Have you had appointments cancelled? Have you had things delayed? Are you waiting for scans or treatment and you're worried about what's going to happen as a result of the strikes? Let us know. Get into the comments. And do you support the doctors' strike? Do you think it's a reasonable ask for 35%? It does seem a bit rich when you just take a figure like that. But on the sidebar of that story there, down the edge, there's doctors that are pointing out they've had a 26% pay cut since 2008, with below inflation increases and stuff like that. The new contract that was imposed by Jeremy Hunt a few years ago, and inflation is now at 10%. So 35% suddenly does seem a bit more in the region of reasonable maths if not sort of attainable maths, but you can see how they got to their sums, if you see what I mean. It may not be attainable, but there's a reason they're asking for that chunk, which is they're pointing out that's how much they're down by. But I think if we all had our pay cut by a quarter, we'd be asking much the same. But the BMA, John, have said they'll negotiate, and this is just their starting position. So, like you said, the government's playing hardball on this. Steve Barclay, the health secretary, who most people couldn't name if they wanted to, is saying that he's just not going to sit down and talk to them. But that didn't work with the ambulance workers, did it? All the nurses. He had to sit down with all of them in the end. So he's going to have to, isn't he? He's got no choice. He just has to cave in a way that looks like he's not.
Yeah, at some point, these two sides are going to have to find some way of finding a deal. I mean, Number 10 yesterday was saying that they had two preconditions for holding talks. One was that the unions needed to call off the strikes that are going on at the moment that are planned for the next few weeks. And the second one was that they did need to ditch this 35% starting point. I mean, I think it would be quite easy for the junior doctors to drop that starting point in talks. I mean, that's clearly a starting point. I do think tactically it is always a bit difficult when the unions do put a figure on this. You saw this with the RCN, the nurses, when they were saying they wanted 5% above inflation, and the government kept pushing this. They want a 19% pay rise. They want a 19% pay rise. This is unreasonable. They want a 19% pay rise. I think that it kind of does hand the government kind of some ammunition by putting a figure on how much you want. Whereas you look at other unions like Unison, they were always very careful that they didn't put a figure on how much they were looking for, because they thought that was not going to be helpful for them and not helpful for kind of getting some solution, when in the end you weren't going to get anywhere near those double figures. So I think it's possibly a mistake, the BMA starting with that starting point, but it's no excuse to the government saying, well, we're not going to hold talks at all to find some sort of figure that is reasonable for the government.
Exactly. Now, we've got a few comments. Dan Beardsall on Twitter is saying that they won't strike for a full year because they need to do a certain number of hours every year in order to progress up the pay band. So he calls BS. I think he may have a point there. Lazy says the only way to solve this is to get round the table. The government doesn't seem to understand how to negotiate. They're useless. They are pretty much. But maybe there's some kind of political strategy in this, John. Is there some genius at work in the back of Steve Barclay's head that none of us can figure out, that is saying this is how I score a win, by looking tough with the unions?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think so far they've miscalculated strikes, that they thought that having a big fight was something that would be quite good. It's something they could use to attack the Labour Party, and it's not quite worked out like that as this has gone on. I mean, you could say, I mean, if you were being really generous, after they finally sorted out the nurses and the ambulance strike, after weeks and weeks and weeks of going on, this was claimed to be one of the ways that Rishi Sunak was Mr. Fix-It. He was coming in and cleaning up his own mess. So maybe, yeah, if you create this big row and then Rishi Sunak manages to sweep in after weeks of chaos and finally get round the table and sort it out, then maybe he can claim this as another win. But I'm not sure. I think most people will see through that and see, hang on a minute, you created out this mess. It's not really that great if you're just sorting out your own problems.
It's me trying to find a positive for the Conservative Party, John, and I'm just trying to see the other side of it. There may be some great strategy in there. Who knows? What do you think, everybody? Is this helping your view of the Conservative Party at all? We don't just have Labour voters on here. There's plenty of people who disapprove of the way the Labour Party is being run. Lazy says there's definitely not a genius in Steve Barclay's head. No one's opened it up to have a look. So, I'm still going to declare myself undecided on that point. But the evidence, I agree, does appear to be pointing pretty much in the opposite direction. Deanna says the government needs to hurry up and give them a pay rise. People's lives are at risk. Give MPs a pay cut to save money. The problem with that, Deanna, they'll say, is there's only 650 MPs and there's 120,000 junior doctors. You can't cut enough pay from the MPs to pay junior doctors anything more than about thrums. So, yes, you can give them a pay cut, and certainly it would look better if they did that. I think £84,000 a year to be an MP is pretty good money. And I'm sure it won't be long, John, before the the government are telling us how much the average junior doctor earns and claiming that actually they're all in clover and half of them are millionaires, aren't they?
Yeah, and you've seen some of the kind of attacks started already. You've looked, a couple of the papers today have got stories about how one of the leaders of the BMA is on holiday this week, which is obviously the biggest scandal of them all, that he's dared to go on holiday. So yeah, I think you are going to see the government fighting back, at least for the time being, throwing some mud back in the other direction.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how long it takes. Maybe we should. Deanna says every penny helps. It does, Deanna. Yes, and anyone who's not on £84,000 a year, perhaps a junior doctor, for example, knows exactly, like you do, Deanna, that every penny does make a difference. But if you're on 84 grand a year, you do tend to think that only in massive chunks of cash, perhaps it would seem. Who knows? But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Perhaps how long it actually takes for the government to get around the table. Perhaps we should have some kind of a sweepstake or bingo on when exactly Steve Barclay's gonna crumble on this one. What would your guesstimate be, John?
Oh,
now are we talking what? Whitsun's in May, June, summer recess?
I think if they've got any sense, they'll sort it out in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, you've had this first round of strikes. You would think that they would want to get this all sorted out, that they could move on to dealing with other issues. But as we know, with the first round of strikes with the ambulance drivers and nurses, that did go on for ages. I'm trying to think how long. I mean, they started long before Christmas, and it's and they've only just been sorted out. So if you go on that sort of time frame, could be a bit of a while. People have got to wait.
Yeah, it might be over the summer, perhaps, when the NHS, hopefully it doesn't have so much work as it normally does over the winter. They'll let that drag on a bit in the hope that actually, because what they did do, I think, that the nurses in particular, was that they kept saying, well, we'd take 10% or we'd take 8%, and it came down a little bit before they got to the table, sort of the main ask. But then inflation also fell a bit, so who knows? I would give it probably another few months, like you say. I think we'll get to the point where it's a year till the next general election. All right, because they're talking about autumn next year, aren't they? So I think we'll get to the autumn and they'll go, we've got to settle it, and then maybe they'll hold up something, but sometime between now and autumn anyway, hopefully, fingers crossed. We'll have to see, won't we? Get into the comments, everybody. Let us know. Have you had any problems with the doctor's strike? What do you think about Suella Braverman's policies? Is she racist or not? Let us know, and we'll try and have a little wrap up towards the end. Now, some people do think it's all sort of entirely affordable if only they hadn't spaffed billions on PPE and that didn't work, and the contracts for their mates. But of course, if they hadn't spaffed the money on that, they had to borrow the money to do that. If they hadn't borrowed the money to do that, then they wouldn't have borrowed the money, so we still wouldn't have the money. I'm afraid that argument doesn't quite hold up necessarily, although we could still, in theory, borrow the money. But anyway, first off in the world, we have managed to find some good news for you, and it's very apt today, so here it is. Now, we love an animal story on this show. This is a very suitable one today. So a toad, no name, Mr. Toad, was taken to Tiggy Winkle's Wildlife Hospital in Buckinghamshire after a walker spotted it hopping around, I presume, in something of a circle, not very well anyway. And the vet, a chap called Steve Smith, found it had fractured its left arm bone. So presumably it was just going around clockwise or something. He conducted one of the centre's smallest ever operations by inserting a tiny plate and 4 little screws to hold the bone in place. It's been a complete success, and the toad is now recovering before being released back into the wild. John, is this proof that medics will help just about anybody if they're given the chance?
I mean, it is amazing when you look at those pictures, how just think the toad, like how teeny tiny it must have been, the kind of amazing skill that took to do an operation that, I mean, I wouldn't be able to do an operation on any horse, but imagine a dog or a horse or whatever. At least you've got something to work with, but so teeny tiny. And I don't think we know the toad's name. I'm surprised they've not named it if they put all this effort into giving it this amazing operation, but not even giving it a name yet. But you also look at the picture there on the page that they've inserted this plate there, and I think the best thing about it is that picture of the X-ray that you can see this toad, the structure of the toad. I don't know, the bones, and then this just plate that's been inserted. That it is just remarkable that somehow this toad's got this amazing tension, and hopefully seems to be back on the road to recovery.
Well, hopefully not on the road. Not a good place for toads to be. Hopefully by the pavement of recovery instead. I suppose it's a sign as well that that they can do amazing things, and that someone's prepared to do the teeniest tiniest thing, the teeniest tiniest organism, just to help them out. Because being a medical person of any sort is a vocation, If Mrs. Tiggy Winkles can do it, and the toads are getting free healthcare at the point of need and emergency treatment, I don't see why the rest of us can't, frankly. But I do hope that that little plate they've put in, it looks like it's about the size of one of those pencil sharpener blades or something. I do hope it's not too heavy, because otherwise, as soon as that toad hits a pond, it's going to sink like an absolute stone. We don't want that to be. Hopefully it's just a lightweight thing and it can swim just fine. All right. Thank you very much, John, for taking us through that. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We're going to let everyone go 5 minutes early, I think, today, because we're going to be back again next Monday, I think. Yes, I think they're back to school, or maybe it's an inset day. Oh, God, I don't know. But we'll be back again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can despair like the rest of us do. Until then, everybody, tatty bye.